All right, let's start. Welcome everybody. A great moment to see you all here at the launch event of the new Ocean Hub for the study of the Anthropocene. The man behind there is responsible to make this possible in terms of the broader funding that comes to the Open Society University network. So welcome also to Sasha Stokovic and thank you for the support. And let me also briefly introduce, for those of you who haven't met, Valeria Hesse, who is the coordinator at the center. And so for the time being, the center is designed for the next 3 years. So Valeria will be with us for that.
Happy to be here.
So warm welcome. And without further ado, and I will give the floor to the director of the new center, Sasha Etkind, who will talk about securitization beyond constructivism, how to understand petroaggression in the era of decarbonization. So warm welcome. We should have like a 1 hour around this. And
plus questions. Well, thanks a lot, Thomas, for this very quick introduction, but much more for helping with organizing the whole thing. And also thanks to Sasha Stokovic and many other people who are behind his back over there in New York and other places, who after long hesitation and delays really have given us this money. And we are launching a big and very ambitious project, and we will be working for 3 years on this, borderless theme, with an ambition to structure it and to give it shape and order, and produce conferences and teaching students and having postdocs here, and publishing collected volumes, and having blogs and things like that. So I very much hope that many of you sitting here will help us in this venture in different roles and positions, and we have some resources to support you in working with us. So with we have also people over there. That's also very cool. All right, so I will start now my talk. One more thing, that with this we are also launching this particular seminar, an academic seminar. So we will meet regularly, twice a month, more or less, so over these 3 years, and we will have invited speakers, some very famous, some kind of less known, but always ambitious and articulate. So please, from now on, plan your schedule, thinking about this particular series of talks. My talk today consists of 3 parts. First, I will share with you my understanding of our current crisis, which I prefer to call late Anthropocene, for having no better term. I will talk about this terminology briefly. Second, I switch to the petrostate, an international actor that used to be the main beneficiary of rapid carbonization in the 20th century, which is largely continuing now. Look at this scheme in which I was trying to chart the actors in the game. In the new age of decarbonization, the age of late Anthropocene, petrostates confront major risks and actual threats. They developed new means for securitizing the changes connected to decarbonization, changes that deprive them, the petrostates, of their profits. Well, the concept of petroaggression, which I will be using in this talk, is pretty well developed in the IR field. I will introduce a concept of carbon resistance, defined as hybrid activities of the petrostate to confront the perceived deprivation that comes with decarbonization. My overall task is to understand how petrostates respond to decarbonization and how resistance turns into war. But first, about the current crisis of late Anthropocene. All of us know about its manifestations, such as heat waves, forest fires, floods, and hurricanes. We know about melting of permafrost in Siberia and Alaska, about climate-induced famines in Africa, and about bankruptcies of ski resorts all over the world, from Japan to the Alps. A fresh example, which you may not know, is the insurance crisis in the United States, which is threatening to exceed the mortgage crisis of 2008. To make this story short, the real cost of home insurance on the coasts of Florida and Louisiana has been skyrocketing because of the expected floods and hurricanes there. To avoid massive foreclosures, individual states create firms working as insurers of last resort and pump some money into these firms. But state governments don't have enough money to cover the future indemnities that could happen, if a serious flood comes to a highly populated resort, for instance. So all this is a sort of fiction waiting for a disaster. The current crisis includes climate change, multiple wars, and huge economic challenges. It is so complex that so far no formulation fits it. There are many notable attempts, however. What happened? That was not it. Okay. Here is the virus.
Sorry for that. I'm just trying to move away this thing because it covers a bit of your slide.
Okay, done. Yeah. Yeah, this is what we need. So there are different formulations that have been given by different authors, such as Adam Tooze from Columbia University, who has called it polycrisis, which alludes to its multidimensional and disorganized nature. There are many things in one. Another American historian, Quinn Slobodian, has called it permacrisis, which alludes to its permanent character. This is a crisis, but it is permanent. In a more optimistic way, Mary Kaldor calls it an experimental rupture. As she recently said here in a lecture that Thomas chaired here at CU, this is a period, we have now a period of political experimentation, rapid change, and new wars and experimental rupture. The late Bruno Latour called it the new climate regime or the state of nature, giving a new breath to Hobbes' formula, the state of nature, the state that confronts and regulates nature rather than people. As Latour put it during the first campaign of Donald Trump, now any election is a choice of climate policy, and any war is a battle for survival in the climate crisis. And the late Ulrich Beck, a great German sociologist, said enigmatically that only the climate change would save us from ourselves. I'm sure you know other formulations, such as famous one by Antonio Gramsci, who said it about different kind of crisis, but it works beautifully here. I would rather disagree with some of these formulas. The crisis is neither pluralistic nor it is permanent. We need to understand the core of it, and the core is a transition from an old model of eco-politics, where eco combines economy and ecology. Both terms come from the same ancient root. So a transition from an old model of eco-politics to another model, which is still very new or even utopian. The driving factor of this transition is not a technological progress as it happened in the earlier revolutions. It is rather the opposite. That's important. Okay. We're hitting the it is rather the opposite. Technological and economic growth has reached the planetary limits and is bouncing down before our eyes. This crisis is very difficult for all. You can, I mean, I will not read it for you, but while I'm not talking, you could also, you could do multitasking. But the crisis is very difficult for all the governments, businesses, and private people as well. We're changing the ways we work, move around, and entertain and eat. This crisis comes with extreme events that hit you directly with no mediation. Experts predicted this crisis long ago, but now it is happening and everyone knows about it. The crisis doesn't belong to experts anymore. It is taking place in everyone's life. Climate events used to be socially constructed, and constructs were dependent. Constructs are always dependent on interpretation. But this constructivist picture is losing its validity and its appeal. Because these are not constructs. Heat waves, hurricanes, or even insurance policies are not interpretable constructs. They are vital threats. They just hit you. And you know it without experts. There is no hope that new PR methods would dispel climate change. We are face to face with the material reality of the crisis. So that was not much about constructivism, now about securitization. Securitization of economy and the environment is not a new concept at all. The leading classic in this field, Barry Bazan, from the very start of his work on securitization theory, envisioned 5 sectors of securitization: the political sector, the economic, the military, the societal, and the environmental sectors. He believed that these sectors, with time, undergo a functional differentiation. Basically, they diverge, they become more independent and separate with time. And this differentiation is a characteristic of the modern society. Now, in the moment of crisis, he wrote about that in 2011. Now, I would register the opposite dynamic. In the crisis, those 5 sectors tend to merge into one. We say a convergence of them rather than divergence. Bazan finished his most recent volume, which is actually about great powers, climate change, and global environmental responsibilities. He finished this volume by saying that addressing climate change needs special responsibilities of the few major environmental powers. Amazingly, this book was released in January 2022. Just a month later, one of those very powers started a major war. Which brings us back to the petrostate. By this concept, we mean oil exporting states such as Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Venezuela, Norway, Qatar, Azerbaijan, Libya, Sudan, and few others. The list was long, but actually there are very few who are still there, not mentioned. The very list is instructive, with the notable exception of Norway, which I will discuss later. Many of these things have been involved in the military conflicts around the planet. Jeff Colgan, who actually introduced the concept of petroaggression to the IR field, defines petrostate as a state which gross revenues, I will read it, which gross revenues from net oil exports constitute at least 10% of annual GDP in a given year. So leaving the numbers aside, what is really important is that the petrostate is constituted not by extraction of fossil fuel, but by exporting. In 2021, Colgan has demonstrated empirically that the petrostates start wars more often than the states of any other type. In other words, so you see, non-petrostate, petrostate, all wars, this particular state in the role of an attack of the family. In other words, petroaggression was the most common type of military conflicts around the world. So in the 2 decades of the century, finishing in 21, the wars that have occurred during the last 2 years only confirm this idea. Russia is a petrostate and Azerbaijan too. Iran and Qatar, 2 petrostates, kept financing Hamas for decades. Venezuela is a classical petrostate. Against whom, we're talking about them who start the wars, against whom do they fight? Sometimes a petrostate starts a war against a neighboring country that also has oil. However, delivery routes are even more important for a petrostate than the oil fields. From these oil fields, the petrostate delivers oil to the consumer, which pays by the products of labor, by cars, computers, weapons, or food, by hard currency that this consumer earns by producing goods, finished goods. We have heard, basically every day we read a lot about the transit issues of seaborne transportation of oil. About the hotspots such as Suez Canal, Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, Malacca Straits, Turkish Straits, and Danish Straits, and also the late Nord Stream 1 and 2. However, more than a half of global oil is transported by land, not by sea, but by land, by pipelines, railways, or even trucks. Between the petrostate and the consumer, there is a transit state. Here's how I see it. And I hope you also see, by the way, someone is so there is a transit state between the petrostate and the consuming, or labor-bound state. And this terrestrial transit also generates enormous tensions. In fact, these tensions are higher or more faithful than the conflicts in in the straits and canals. Examples of the transit state are Georgia and Ukraine for Russia, Armenia and Georgia for Azerbaijan, Cameroon for Chad, and to some extent Kuwait for Iraq. The transit states charge serious money for transportation, and way more importantly, they have power over the transit. They can block the trade, and this is an existential threat to the petrostate. A war for annexing the transit state is a particular type of petroaggression, which I believe is more common and more important than a war for the foreign oil fields, for the assets. Such a war for the transit state is typical for terrestrial petrostates such as Russia, for its neighbors such as Azerbaijan, and for landlocked petrostates in Africa. This is why we hear less about this kind of wars, because in the seaborne transportation, there is no transit state. The tankers go through the high seas. There are conflicts there. More familiar for conflicts that are more familiar for Atlantic powers and therefore for us, the public. In the last decades, we've seen both types of petroaggression. There was for delivery routes on land and sea, Russia versus Ukraine, Russia versus Georgia, Azerbaijan versus Armenia, the dark story of Nord Stream, the Western coalition against Yemen and Iran, and more. In contrast, the Iraq invasion of Kuwait and the declared intention of Venezuela to capture the oil-rich Guyana are examples of a war for the oil assets, not for delivery routes, but for the oil assets. Finally, in the Gaza conflict, we see the combination of many motivations and typologies. Even if a petrostate has no understandable or rational interest in attacking or subverting its neighbor, it has financial means to do it. In some cases, this is the best explanation that we have, or the one. Political economic nature of petrostate is relatively well studied. This is a sample of books on the subject. And there are myriads of articles, of course. There's also a small library of books about Russia as a petrostate. Timothy Mitchell demonstrated that labor intensity of a natural resource defines its political features. This is a great book. Coal, Mitchell claims, was a natural platform for social democracy because it was labor intensive. And capital intensive oil has given us neoliberalism. Different natural resources have different political qualities. A hypothesis that I extended to other cases in my Nature's Evil. Michael Ross has shown that oil revenues are usually big, relatively obscure, and do not require much labor. Before I go to another slide, this book by the oldest book by Fernando Coronel about Venezuela, the magical state, is possibly still the best book on that subject. So this is Michael Ross, the oil curse, and he shows that petrostates have larger governments than their neighbors, which do not possess oil. So he compares the percentage of GDP that is controlled by the government versus the private businesses between the petrostate and neighboring countries. So petrostates have larger governments than their neighboring countries that do not possess oil. They have higher inequality and more corruption. It would be interesting to compare the neighboring Russia, Poland, and Ukraine in these terms. The results would be probably similar to this. One distinctive feature of oil is that it tends to displace with time other sectors of the economy, an effect which the economists call the Dutch disease, and political scientists call oil curse, and Latin American scholars call extractivism. There are, more or less this different disciplinary denominations. They mean pretty much the same. Economists give various explanations to the Dutch disease and propose various ways of healing it. One such method works well in Norway, where all profits from the oil and gas trade have been locked in a sovereign fund for future generations. Think about how it works, because it's really a kind of historical illustration to the intensity of the oil curse. So in Norway, oilmen drill the fuel and traders sell it, and they get their salaries. But nobody gets the profits, which are very high. In Norway, that was 50 billions in 2022, and well more than $1 trillion through the recent decades. These profits are not used, so they are locked, or their use is deferred uncertainly for the future generation. But oil and gas is burnt now, though mostly in foreign countries that buy this oil from Norway. So this arrangement alleviates the political symptoms of the fossil use, such as the oil curse, but it's still disastrous for its climate side, because the fossils are being burned. And Norwegians, like anybody else on the planet, breathe the emissions. The Russian government also created such a fund in the past, and it worked to some extent. But when this government started the war, the fund was unlocked. And profits from the oil trade, as well as the savings from this fund, go directly into the treasury and finance the war and corruption. As Fernando Coronel demonstrated some 30 years ago on the case of Venezuela, the petrostate operates a vicious circle, undergoing an increasing specialization. It sees the oil and gas trade as its existential interest. A transit state is one threat to this existential interest, and now decarbonization is another threat. With decarbonization, prices might still be rising, prices for oil and gas, but the volumes of trade will consistently go down. This existential threat is the more securitized, the more specialized is petrostate. That makes sense. The higher is the proportion of fuel export in GDP, the more it is in danger. However, this was all a surprise for the international community. As we saw it in Europe, the leaders of energy transition imagine it as common cause, since it is in the interest of humanity, the whole planet, and everyone around. So everyone would chip in and take equal part in the pain of the process. And the process should be as fair, and then it would be working fine. As we know, many countries of the world made their net zero pledges. Conspicuously, petrostates are not there. The petrostate sees decarbonization as a zero-sum game, not as a common cause, but as a zero-sum game. Even worse, it could be a conspiracy to deprive the petrostate of its essential profits. Every solar farm, windmill, or nuclear power plant means that less oil and gas would be bought from the carbon exporting country. For example, here are the initiatives, famous now, initiatives of decarbonization accepted and working all around the world. For example, the well-known European benchmarks, they're here, the European Green Deal. Halving emissions by 2030 and reducing them to net zero by 2050 would translate into proportional reductions of the European coal, oil, and gas imports, which means a proportional reduction of the revenue of the supplying petrostates. And of course, for Europe, before the war, it was largely Russia. One other example, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which should start working fully in 2026. So this mechanism would increase the European prices of Russian aluminum and cement by 16%, which would proportionally reduce its purchases. This ambitious program was proposed in 2021. The European Green Deal, which promised to halve the burning of fossil fuel by 2030, was announced in 2020 and was legislated by the Euro Parliament in 2021. In Russia, all this was understood as a trade war. And surprise, surprise, it was followed by a shooting war. Understanding the war in Ukraine as a trade war, as a preventive attack on the European and global plans of decarbonization, does not exclude other motives, such as Russia's imperial ambitions or nostalgic Soviet revanchism. It probably all works together, like in any major war. Think about Napoleonic wars. There were economic underpinnings, there were historical turmoil, there were personal ambitions. And a good story brings all these different sides together in a good narrative. In any war, geographic, economic, cultural, and ideological factors come together. It is also true that after does not mean because of. So the fact that the war has started right after this decarbonization decisions does not necessarily mean that this will happen because of them. But of course, in the case of war, we are very eager to construct such causality. In the final account, this comes to the dilemma of the weak versus the strong reading of the global crisis. If we see it as a polycrisis, which is a weak reading, we assume that it's just, many different crises that just happen simultaneously for some unknown reason. So we could assume that contemporaneity of the war with decarbonization is just a coincidence. If we see the crisis as hierarchically organized, with the planetary limits as its cause and reason, we acknowledge the causal relations between the global decarbonization plans and the actions of petrostate. To be sure, the petrostate is not the only source of inequality and war and evil in the world. The responsibility of the consuming states, such as Austria and many, many others. So those states who buy fossil fuel and take a share in the profits. The responsibility of the consuming states is also very significant. However, my argument is that in energy transition, the petrostate is the most vulnerable part of the supply chain. Importing states have proved their ability to absorb the ups and downs of energy supply. They have their issues. The American fear of increasing petrol prices is an extreme example of these issues. But importing states also have diversity of technologies and flexibility of supplies that the petrostates do not have. Specialized and ultra-conservative petrostates preserve themselves largely unchanged, as if they live in a different historical time. Securitizing the very advance of green and lean modernity, these countries feature what I call carbon resistance, the policies of distrust, denial, and misinformation. Some of these operations are directed against the transit countries, some against consuming countries, and some against one's own population. Petroaggression, an open war, is the most extreme manifestation of carbon resistance. In a recent study, Climate and Migration to Shape the EU Election. So the citizens of 9 European countries were asked which event has had the biggest impact on their future. They had some options that they had to choose from. Younger people are most likely to name climate change. Older people mention immigration as the event that changed their life, their future. In Eastern Europe, people feel more engaged with the war in Ukraine than with other options. The coming elections to the Euro Parliament will see a fight between the right, who focus on migration, and the left with their green activism. But in a closer look, all three dominant issues are interconnected. Migration all over EU is now defined by the war in Ukraine. Experts know it, but many people still think about migrants in traditional terms, as if they mostly come from Africa. Most of them now come from Ukraine. And as I argue in this talk, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is intrinsically connected to climate change. With this understanding, the new Euro Parliament will not be that much divided after all. Thank you very much.
Good, Alexander, for this very stimulating talk. Lots of ideas on the table, so the floor is open. If nobody wants to start, then I make a start for the first question. Which follows on this central argument about the weak interpretation or weak crisis interpretation of contemporaneity or simultaneity versus a stronger one, which actually talks about causal connections. I was wondering, like, if you connect this argument or like this dichotomy to the other distinction that you only briefly touched upon on the question of petrostates relationship to the question of security and war, in terms of, on the one hand, the sort of the the ends that petrostates might pursue with wars or like instability versus the means. If I bring these two together, my question would be whether the argument is not a very different one if we focus on the ends as opposed to the means, in the sense that in a similar way than what we know from the political economy research about the resource curves and the Dutch disease and so on, where less emphasis is usually placed on intentionality, the ends, like that something happens, as opposed to things happening because of unintended consequences or side effects that are actually not really sort of intended by anyone, but that happen anyways because of the economic effects that happen, or the effects on political representation and so on. But it's essentially about, it's not really that there's any kind of sort of motivation here to be discernible. And so I'm simply wondering whether this argument about connecting petrostates to war would look very different if you focus on the means. And I do not know the research as well as you do, but like that from my point of view would make a lot of sense. Also, like we have a lot of evidence that would suggest that the wealth that derives from oil in particular or other natural resources is regularly, simply by virtue of being available, regularly functions as an incentive for states to engage or to pursue certain objectives or policy objectives or strategies that they would anyways want to do, but because they lack the means, they would perhaps not be able to pursue. And so the question is simply whether, like I guess I'm talking around a lot, so whether this is kind of a question of intention here, or whether it is actually that the oil makes it possible for petrostates to engage in what they.
Yeah, great question, right in the heart of the matter, because that really shows the change that comes with the turn from the ascending part of the curve to the descending part. It's like from carbonization to decarbonization. So as long as the demand for the fossil fuel was steadily increasing, both volumes were increasing, and also most of the periods the prices were also increasing, and that was going for decades in a kind of predictable way. So this petrostates, the producers and beneficiaries of this trade, were doing fine, and there was no issue of intentions, because the intention was just to enrich themselves, and they had legitimate ways of doing so. This is their property after the nationalization of oil that happened in largely after 1973. So, in the context of growth and carbonization, there was no bad intention. Everything was fine. The producers were happy and the consumers were also happy. But with decarbonization, the things change, and so this issue of securitization of this particular threat is new, because it has come with the new decarbonization policies. which were discussed like for 2 decades, someone would say for 5 decades, because the Club of Rome, which started this conversation, it was founded in 1968, half a century ago. But on the high political levels, that was still debated, and finally the decisions were made. They were official, with by the European Community, European Union, and then by the United States and by China. And with this change of the curve, the issue of intention or actual perspective, which is also the issue of the perceived threats and the responses to these threats, the chosen responses, it has become suddenly relevant.
I think we had the first hand there online, so I would suggest we switch one question from the audience here and one question from the room. So Brian, please go ahead. Brian, are you with us? Okay, maybe Brian.
Maybe they cannot unmute them. Maybe they cannot unmute. You can unmute them.
Why not?
Well, probably they don't have a. Probably the administrator has to unmute them, so they can ask.
Okay, maybe.
No.
That doesn't seem to work.
Ryan?
Okay, let's take another question in the meantime.
Yeah, thanks. This was very rich and a little hard to build into one picture, but trying. My question is about the alternative hypothesis. Clearly, this is a story about the Petroaggression, the explanation why these petrostates go to war, they can go to war, and they are afraid of losing losing it and becoming weak and poor. So the anxiety provokes aggression. However, if we look to what the petrostates themselves are saying and thinking, we get the opposite picture. Of course, I can speak for the Russian security discourse because I know it better. I would guess that there are similar narratives in other petrostates too. But of course, the Russian story is not at all like that, as you know. They think that in the situation of the growing scarcity of the resources, the oil and gas will be more valuable. Therefore, they are afraid of the adjacent countries actually attacking them and taking their resources. It sounds funny, but I do think that they genuinely believe this, and this has been for decades. That's why, like in their perception, they attacked Ukraine, not because they wanted to control the transit route, at least consciously, not so. They were building Nord Stream, they were thinking of the North sea route, their options, not necessarily to go to war, just to protect the pipeline. It's a good argument factor, but again, they have this kind of securitization argument of being the most important, the most ecologically strategic land in the world. Again, even if this is ridiculous, what do you think? Like, should we simply ignore these narratives, or they matter because this is like their perceived reality?
So questions like, should we try to collect a few, or you would like respond immediately?
It's a follow-up on that one. I think in the argument there are actually two kinds of petroaggression. And to clarify it for myself, I would call one old petroaggression, that is before the downward turn of the curve, and the new petroaggression. So example of the old petroaggression in your argument is, for example, aggression against transit countries, neighboring transit countries, because they may be perceived as some kind of a threat. But when it comes to new petroaggression, when actually the threat is decarbonization, then transit countries should be seen as natural allies because they are the most implicated in the process. So they share interests with petrostates in keeping the process going, right? And here, the interesting difference would be to look at the difference between Ukraine and the Baltic states. And that is actually not a speculative difference because Putin invoked it 5 or 6 or 7 years ago when he first started blackmailing Ukraine over oil payments. And in one of his press conferences, he then said, look, we have no problems with the Baltic states. They are paying, we are fine. But they're actually one of the biggest beneficiaries from the transit of Russian oil and gas and coal. Yeah, so, but the Baltic states, unlike the Ukraine, because of their integration into the EU context, they may be seen to a greater extent, to a much greater extent, as potential advocates of decarbonization, unlike Ukraine. So from that perspective, what should follow from your argument is that the Baltic states are a bigger threat than Ukraine on the downward side of the curve. And the only thing maybe that prevents Russia from attacking, say, Tallinn rather than Kiev is NATO.
They would like to.
Yeah, but that means that we are still in the old kind of security construction, and climate emergency resistant to decarbonization doesn't change anything. All you need really is NATO on your borders.
Okay, I think one last one online, if
I think we actually have 3 people online, so I
let's take
see.
one online.
Okay. So Brian, I think, was able to unmute finally.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, Alexander Etkind, thank you so much for your book and your contribution here. I wanted to mention that one of the great things about this book that you have is that it doesn't do the circular argumentation that other historical works have done recently. That is, Serhii Plokhy or Michel Tsigar, they all give you nationalist histories. And it seems to be this circular way of looking at the entire conflict without an exit strategy. That is, where are we in global history? What is the status of citizenry of the earth? And how do you negotiate these things without recurrence to this very circular argument? So I think that's where it connects with cosmopolitanism and so on. The question I would like to ask you, though, is, isn't this like a frustrating facet of this whole conflict that everyone refers back to national identities in order to negotiate what is happening, whereas there is a global struggle on right now? And these define nations more than the nations and their discourses define themselves.
Okay, I think we have quite a few big issues there.
Yeah, big and very big, I would say. So the question of Artemy Magun, should we listen to Russia, to the Russian own arguments? I think we have experts such as Anton Shekhowsov. I mean, experts should listen to these arguments and study them and whatever, quantify them, for instance, and criticize them. But this is a part of this, what I call carbon resistance, which is basically a softer side of petroaggression. Carbon resistance starts well before the actual war starts. Petroaggression is, as it is researched by Colgan, it's an actual shooting war. But carbon resistance starts much earlier and ends much later, and has many other ways and means, like ideological and informational war and complex hybrid operation. And you know what you Artemий quoted is a part of this kind of campaign, which of course should be deconstructed, should be studied and deconstructed, but you know, has no real political circulation, I think, or meaning. Now, this is very interesting. Alexander Askar's question about the Baltic states and Ukraine. The Baltic states were also transit countries for Russian fossil fuel. But first, the volumes were much incomparably lower than the Ukrainian volumes. Russia paid and still pays, like, you know, in the midst of this war, natural gas still goes through Ukraine by the Druzhba friendship pipeline. And everything, you know, is kind of exploding around, you know, bombs and shells and mines. And of course, to stop this pipeline is, you know, technical. They possible, but it still goes. And Gazprom, in the midst of all this, pays Ukraine $2 billion amount. $2 billion amount. That's probably much more than
Dollars? $2 billion?
Yeah, dollars. Yeah. So, but say Latvia, which has shipped much of Russian coal, I stopped doing it, and that's, you know, a part of the sanctions. And in this particular direction, the sanctions work. While Ukraine has declared that they will stop transiting Russian gas sometimes this year, 24. But of course, we will see will it happen or not. So far, you know, it's an amazing story, of course. Also thinking about, like, say, Napoleonic War, you know, the continental blockade was a major part of it, like trade was stopped. But here, it doesn't work the same way. All right.
Napoleon didn't succeed.
Yeah, but Brian Paul's question is, of course, was more like a statement, and was very sort of nice to hear this statement. And I do believe that my approach is kind of more global and more inclusive than some other approaches, which are, of course, they very legitimately they start from national interests and securitized threats. But there is still the planet, and of course, any war is a disruption, and it boosts nationalism and kind of the local sacrifices and local interests and local ambitions. That's their time. But of course, we, the experts, should not be losing the global context of the events.
Others online?
Yeah, there are two more questions online. The first one is coming from Sparty. Sparty, floor is yours.
Hello. How is the communication? Can you hear me?
Hear you. We can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. First of all, thank you for the great presentation, and hello to everyone. I would like to make one comment that in the discourse about the war on Ukraine, one component is strangely missing, and that is the return on investment for Russia. Every war is an investment on resources, and when people talk about the war and resolution of the war, it is rather interesting that this component seems to be very frequently missing. And I think the way you are going, Alexander, that gives us a great perspective to discuss that very important aspect, that the nature of the Russian petrostate is actually a great element to explore the return of investment for this for the incentive for Russia to conduct a war on Ukraine as its neighbor, which is kind of nebulous if you look at the realist discourse that are trying to make it about this power struggle between rational state actors, which kind of lacks a little bit in explaining the war motivation. And a little bit the question that I have is, if we look at war, at petroaggression, and we expand it a little bit in a wider context, one thing that you mentioned in your presentation is the nature of inequality, especially inside of petrostate societies. We see this very interestingly in Russia, who have transformed from basically from the imperial past, also an inequality structure inside of the society between different stratae and different sovereign subjects of Russia. So basically the inequality and the oppression, so to say, inside of the society has created a structure with oligarchs, with sort of corruption. And it seems to me that we have two sorts of petrostates. Some who are trying to transform, like Saudi does, like some of the states in the Gulf, the United Arabian Emirates. United States is also, in some sense, a petrostate. They also try to transform into an economy of labor and an economy of innovation. But what Russia is trying to do with a hybrid attack on Europe and the liberal democracies, they are trying to export their system of government, systematic corruption, and hence trying to create a political system that enables them to make us still dependent on the resource level. I think that is an important aspect. And I also see a little bit side effects like, you know, this whole cryptocurrency where we see the transformation of energy, meaning the product of petrostates, into something that is then transformed into real value, into assets that you can buy basically from Western states, transfer money, etc. I think there is a whole host of mechanisms at work to support this petroaggression and affect our societies to transform them into this structure of inequality, this petro inequality, so to say, and inject that into our societies. What do you think? Is that an interesting concept, or am I on the wrong way? Thanks.
Okay, great, thanks. Maybe if I can inject just one follow-up on this to reiterate the skeptical question, which is on the return on investment. So is there really a return on investment here if we think about it as a kind of an intentional campaign, right? So, and isn't it actually it's hard to believe, like I you know, like if you look at the evidence, it seems completely obvious that there is no return on investment for Russia here. On the contrary, if you look at all what is happening in terms of the energy policies around the world, I mean around the world, but at least let's say the European Union, and that for ages were kind of, you know, buying. So that seems to have basically accelerated, if anything, like, you know, they talk about the Green Deal now on steroids, of how fast things are moving. So it's hard to believe like that one can talk about a return on investment here. Like, I mean, when you think about gas, I mean, they are burning the gas like they are because they cannot sell it anywhere. And, you know, what is like, it's hard to believe that they didn't anticipate this actually as a loss rather than a return on investment. But that's just a kind of to reiterate what I said earlier, I think already. So are there...
Can I respond
Sure.
to these two questions? Because they work together anyway. So I think what was called return on investment, so this has two meanings. One is kind of a legal meaning, and another is a corrupted meaning. So I think what was meant was this return on investment in a highly corrupted country, so that war, in other words, war helps some economic actors to return their investments and basically to enrich themselves because of the whatever of the cause of the war, but also because of their patriotic feelings, produced by this war, and because of many factors. So those who are really close to the center of power, they get their returns, and probably they do have their returns on the much higher scale than it happened during the last 10 years, which was like stagnation in Russia. But should we care about this return? I don't think so. But I fully agree with you, Thomas, that there is no gain that Russia actually has gotten in this war. And moreover, all the official declarations and ambitions and promises have been turned against the declared intention. The best I call it nemesis. The best example is the NATO, like the war was launched in order to keep NATO away from the Russian borders, but as a result of the war, Finland and Sweden are in the NATO, and they are much closer to the Russian borders than Ukraine would ever be if Ukraine ever will be a member of the NATO. So in nemesis, this intention turns against the doer, and it comes back to the doer in kind of in exaggerated form. Like Putin wanted to spread the Russian language. Now Ukrainians are studying Ukrainian language, trying to forget their Russian. And so many people around the world feel the same thing. So that's nemesis. Now about petroequality, I think that's a great term, and actually, Michael Ross in his book shows empirically that in many petrostates around the world, inequality is higher than in the neighboring countries, which share, say, the same religion, the same climate. Many things are similar, but the differentiating thing is oil and just huge capitals and low labor intensity. Very few people are involved in all the processes, extraction and transit. And that makes these petrostates highly unequal. And the same goes to Russia. Because in Russia, only 1% of the Russian population is involved in the oil and gas business, including all parts of it. And this 1% brings like a half of the budget and things like that.
I think maybe a question from the audience.
Can I have a follow-up to Thomas's? Because there was another point, and this for me is a genuine question. Because another part of Thomas's argument was that he finds it hard to believe that in Russia they couldn't foresee this acceleration of decarbonization, which was already happening for some time and is now accelerated, right? I correctly summarize it. But for me, it's actually a question. I wonder whether this is the case, that even with all the data available, this is the trend that they call it irrationally, but cannot accept. Because if this argument is accepted, that, for example, decarbonization is possible, just like, for example, non-traditional families are possible, that goes to the very core of Russian, at least political identity, that was built around extraction and exporting of natural resources for centuries. So to accept this argument that this party is over is basically to say that, well, Russian history has ended. And something new is coming, something new with which we have no experience. Maybe, for example, with the exception of the Novgorod Republic, which in the traditional Russian discourse is considered to be a bad practice. Right? So, and I really wonder whether this may be indeed the case, that they just refuse to believe certain interpretations of data analysis and so on and so forth. And they say, no, the world is like it always was. They will be always buying our oil and gas because we cannot imagine ourselves otherwise.
Although I think that is there's a kind of it's a triple question, right? So on the one hand, it's like what you were saying is more like that we don't know whether they thought about this very much because it's so ingrained that it's basically impossible to even
if they
imagine
they just
otherwise.
don't accept it.
Yes, but that is different from saying like that it was actually that it would be an argument to start a war.
Yeah, that
is kind of a different thing.
That I agree.
So there is another question
Another question.
from Andrei Belli, who has been waiting for quite a while now.
Yeah, please.
Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the discussion. I would like, first of all, to answer the question which was actually asked right now about Russia and climate decarbonization commitments in the European Union. It was pretty tricky. I followed the topic since 2019. Basically, some Russian stakeholders, mostly related to aluminium industry, were quite supportive to the idea of decarbonization because they were practically put in a favorable position against Chinese exporters in Europe. So they were basically teaming up with the European stakeholders who were pushing for the carbon adjustment border CBAM mechanism. Then there were obviously those who were strictly against any decarbonization, but they, let's say, those who were against also sided entirely with Russian geopolitical, let's say, agenda. Those who were pro-decarbonization, they remained silent. However, when you look at the political discourses and reactions to Ukraine and to decarbonization, the two processes seem to me entirely independent one from another. All activities in Ukraine started in 2014, and the first decree that actually was announced by Kremlin asking the parliament, the Russian parliament, to allow them to enter militarily in Ukraine dated of March 2014. So basically, Ukraine's strategy of Russian, let's say, strategy to invade Ukraine precedes the European decarbonization. And then some comments regarding the overall topic. It seems to be pretty deterministic to put it in a way that there is a kind of like juxtaposition between petrostates and non-petrostates. The main juxtaposition is rather between the emerging economies like China and India and the old capitalist West, like the European Union, Japan, and the United States. And that enters into very interesting logic, which rather resembles the logic described by Immanuel Wallenstein in his academic works about center-periphery and semi-periphery interactions. And that's exactly what we are observing. So I would say it would have been more interesting and accurate to look at it in this perspective. And decarbonization comes as an instrument for the old West or for the old economies to readapt to their new position of, let's say, in relation with the emerging economies. And the emerging semi-territories, they are viewing it as a former colonial approach. Yeah, so they're reacting it as it was a colonial approach. And by the way, CBAM, both in China and in India, are viewed as a colonial approach. You know, I see the Brian's point. The European debate on decarbonization became before the 2014 actions. That's true, but the decarbonization, not in the sense of the Green Deal, not in the sense of the climate neutrality. Let's not conflate the energy and climate policies that existed between the year 2000 and 2019 and everything which happens after the 2019. And that's my final point. Everything in Europe which happens after 2019 provokes very deep controversies within the European industries, within the European political class. And one of the topics of the parliamentary elections will be exactly the failure or the success of the Green Deal. And that may be way more challenging as a topic because we may have 3-4 different positions regarding the topic rather than two. Thank you for giving me the floor. And thank you for the presentation.
You have another big issue on the table. We can maybe, if there is one last question, we could take one, Mark. Okay, last two questions, and then maybe you can have the last.
Yeah. I feel like my question ties to like Professor Fesser's first question, sort of like the means and the ends. And I'm wondering like if you're not completely understating the like when we look at sort of the numbers of like petroaggressive states, sort of the wars, like the statistics you showed, statistics look a lot different if you keep one very important fact in mind, that's the nationality conflict, ethnic conflicts, and in terms of the Middle East, religious conflict between Sunni and Shia. I think that everything which goes around Iraq was like the first Gulf War between Iraq and Iran. Right, which was not because Saddam was suddenly running out of money because the oil business didn't go. Like there was no reason for that war for economical reasons, right? So, and the same with the absolutely brutal collapse of Libya was because of ethnic tensions a lot more than because Gaddafi wasn't able to find his oil business anymore or something. So it'd be the same with Nigeria and etc. etc. I think even with Russia, I definitely think that the imperialist argument tends to be more important than the oil argument, in my personal opinion, for the war in Ukraine now. So long story short, if we take other factors into account, which might be for the onset of a war more important than oil, which might be more means of fueling a war, how many statistical cases are we really left with, which are actually petro wars, sort of? And I have a bit of the idea that probably this number shrinks very considerably. And indeed, oil is more of a means to fuel conflict a lot more than it actually is the reason why to start it in the first place.
That's the question that I really wanted to ask.
Yeah, thank you, Sasha, for presentation. And I think that there are a lot of reasons to see the picture in this way. And to see this, I appreciate this concept of petroaggressiveness or something like this. But my point is that besides the tension in international relations because of resources, natural resources, and so on, there are tensions because of natural resources in domestic politics, because the problem of the control over the resources is a very important question of domestic politics in such contexts, in petrostates. And that is why we should to look more properly on those mechanisms of which build petroaggressiveness, those mechanisms which are connected with the domestic politics. And here we see one very important thing which distinguishes petrostates from other developing or emerging states. They do not interested so much in foreign investments. They have another way to get money from the world market, and that makes that gives much more chances for nationalist parties to win the elections and to fix the domestic political stage. And this is what we see, that they use nationalism to control different parts of elites, use nationalism to win the struggle for control over resources. And what is interesting, they do this, and after that we see that, but the state became much more aggressive because of nationalism. But after that we see the crisis of this resource-based nationalism, because a lot of petrostates are in crisis and are reducing their opportunities, their opportunities to get money from their resources. We see Venezuela, Iran, Russia, countries which cannot now sell their resources because of their nationalism and aggressiveness. And I see this like this story of development of nationalism like a leverage to get control of the resources in domestic politics, which led to crisis, to political crisis, and when you cannot get profit from your resources. So
Well, that's negative.
Another big.
That's negative. Yeah.
And the last,
Very last.
but not the least common question is from Evgeny Roshin. Most petrostates are former colonies of the European powers. Does that reflect in any way in this theory you are proposing the success of these states as powers in the global international societies, partly due to the natural resources base, particularly oil? Now they confront the Western discourse of environmental responsibilities, which mean for them an attempt at de-subjectifying by the former colonies.
Yeah, all right. Well, first, there are so many, so many perspectives on these hugely complex issues, and that's a great value to, but also it's a great challenge to, trying to keep them together rather than, doing an exclusion operation. Like this is the best explanation, and that means that a lot of explanations are irrelevant. I think the logic should be the opposite one, trying to have them all together and connecting them, building some kind of hierarchy, some kind of logical chain, like maybe some causality, one thing precedes another. But this is all real. Everything that has been said here is highly, highly relevant. How do they combine? Do they, do these arguments match? That's another issue. How exactly would we tell a story that would combine all these arguments? That's a huge challenge, and and we are working on it. Now, going to some details. So, did they know in the Kremlin about the imminent decarbonization plans? They did. So there is a long story that has been told by several researchers, including myself. It's the first chapter of my book, Russia Against Modernity. And I say that was the first, this news about climate change and decarbonization was first met with denial, just outright denial. This thing cannot happen. This is all wrong. Or has nothing to do with oil and fossil fuel. Then there was a period of deception, and then there was a period of aggression. So there were many debates among the Russian scholars and experts and some kind of court economists, including the economic advisor to Putin. And they were competing, so basically strategies of denial were competing with strategies of deception. About denial, that's pretty clear. About deception, there was an interesting thing that the emissions produced on the territory of the former Soviet Union, or specifically on the territory of Russia, after 1991 has collapsed by many. That was the biggest decline of emissions in the history of the 20th, 21st centuries. That was the biggest single case of the fall of emissions because of deindustrialization on the territory of Russia. So many factories stopped working or worked less, etc.
And it's like on the chart, it's spectacular. And the idea in the Kremlin and some kind of court economists were trying to write a plan how to sell this pool of emissions. Like if Russia were included in something like the emission trading scheme, like of a kind that is operating now in the European Union. Like if Russia were there, and if that fall of 1991 was acknowledged and converted into money, that would be a huge money that Russia would be, would actually receive rather than pay. That could be kind of, whatever, operated in different ways, and they were debating about that. And that's why, Russia entered the Paris Treaty, exactly when America, that was exactly the same treaty, I think, that America, under Trump, left. Russia signed all these commitments and in hope that it would be included in the new calculus of emissions. It was not. For pretty clear reasons that you could make this argument why it had not been included. But that was a major disappointment. And then it turned into, looking at the timeline, that was very kind of nicely fit with the start of the Russo-Ukrainian war in 2014. These debates turned into war. Once again, this contemporaneity doesn't mean causality. But we need to really investigate the conjectures. So there was an interesting reference to Wallerstein, which is somehow relevant, I think, though dated nowadays, largely, and irrelevant for this particular discussion because really the socialist world was never a part of Wallerstein's typologies. There was Quinn periphery, and then when he was asked, like, how about the Soviet Union, and even China, he said that's semi-periphery. That's something like a hybrid or whatever, like a gray zone. Like he doesn't have to say anything specific about this semi-periphery things. And I think also Wallerstein would understand the peculiarity of oil, which I think you might also do not understand. Because imperialism was historical imperialism, that's a big thing, but imperialism was always about natural resources that were located over there. And we take this land, we make it into a colony, and we have this rubber or this ivory or this oil. Imperialism is about appropriating resources. All right, I'm sure that I have forgotten the most spectacular questions, but that was absolutely great discussion. Thank you very much. The question about nationalism. Yeah, I don't have a clear answer, but I think that's a very good model. Why I find it attractive, because it connects these issues of primary products like oil with the issues of high spiritual agitation or illusion or fantasy like nationalism, and they are intrinsically connected. The challenge is to understand this connection in a kind of clear, understandable narrative.
Thank you so much. Great discussion. Also, thank you to everybody, and we wish the center all the best, and we will all attend the subsequent events.
With contribute.
Thank you for all the online participants for being with us.
Yeah, I mean.
So wish us many happy returns.